Imagine a city rising from a massive lake, shining in the sun. Welcome to Tenochtitlan in the year 1519. It was a marvel of the world. With over 200,000 residents, it was larger, cleaner, and arguably more beautiful than London, Paris, or Rome at the time. A true megacity. This was the beating heart of the Aztec Empire. The Mexica were the undisputed heavyweights of Mesoamerica, dominating through military strategy. At the center of it all was Emperor Moctezuma II. He sat on a throne of absolute power, ruling millions with an iron and feathered fist. They relied on aggressive taxation and heavy tributes to keep the gods happy and the empire running. But their rule wasn't exactly popular. In February 1519, a storm was brewing across the ocean. A highly ambitious explorer named Hernán Cortés landed on the Mexican coast. Cortés brought around 500 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. Against an empire of millions, this looked like a collective suicide mission. The math was insane. 500 Spaniards versus potentially hundreds of thousands of fiercely trained Aztec warriors. The odds were not great. Reports of floating mountains and men riding giant deer reached the capital. Moctezuma was conflicted. Were they gods? Or invaders? Instead of crushing them, Moctezuma sent lavish gifts of gold, hoping they would take it and leave. He couldn't have been more wrong. Giving gold to a 16th-century conquistador is like throwing gasoline on a fire. It only proved the empire was incredibly wealthy. But Cortés had a problem. Some of his men were scared. They wanted to take the gold and run back to Cuba. Mutiny was in the air. So, Cortés did something remarkably insane. He ordered his own ships to be scuttled and sunk. There was no going back. Conquer or die. This psychological masterstroke forced his men to commit. But 500 men couldn't do this alone. They needed an edge. And they were about to find one. The stage was set. While the Spanish marched, Moctezuma was about to make his first fatal mistake, hesitation. The empire's fate was sealed. Cortés's greatest weapon wasn't his steel swords, cannons, or rudimentary firearms. It was actually a brilliant indigenous woman known as La Malinche. Gifted to the Spanish as a slave, she fluently spoke both Nahuatl, the dominant language of the Aztec Empire, and the Mayan language. Combined with a stranded Spanish priest who spoke Mayan, Cortés suddenly had a direct, real-time communication line right into the heart of the empire. She wasn't just a translator. La Malinche quickly became his voice, his top strategist, and his cultural guide in a deeply complex political landscape. This brings us to the second massive factor, geopolitics. The Aztec Empire was not a happily unified nation. It was more like a Mafia-style protection racket. The Aztecs ruthlessly demanded heavy tributes of food, luxury goods, and human captives from all their neighboring subjects. To put it simply, everyone hated them. When Cortés marched inland, he didn't try to fight everyone. Instead, he played the ultimate game of diplomacy, looking for the angriest neighbors. He approached the Tlaxcalans, a fierce, independent republic that had successfully resisted Aztec conquest for decades, but was slowly suffocating under brutal economic blockades. After a brief but brutal skirmish to test the Spanish mettle, the Tlaxcalans realized these steel-clad strangers were the perfect weapon to destroy their ancient enemy. Overnight, Cortés was no longer leading a ragtag group of 500 Spaniards. He was now at the head of a massive, heavily armed indigenous coalition. Bolstered by thousands of battle-hardened Tlaxcalan warriors, this unified force marched straight toward Tenochtitlan. Inside the capital, Moctezuma faced a paralyzing dilemma. His royal advisors were completely split. Some generals demanded an immediate, crushing ambush, while the priests and nobles urged extreme caution. Moctezuma ultimately chose diplomacy over war, a fatal miscalculation that would seal his doom. He allowed the invaders to walk right through his front door. On November 8, 1519, the unthinkable happened. Hernán Cortés and Emperor Moctezuma finally met face-to-face on the Grand Causeway leading into the floating megacity. It was an unprecedented clash of two entirely alien worlds. Moctezuma welcomed the heavily armed strangers into the city as honored guests. A ticking time bomb. The Spanish were lodged in the lavish palace of Moctezuma's father. They were utterly mesmerized by the towering pyramids, bustling markets, and intricate canals. But the awe quickly turned to terror. They realized they were essentially trapped on an island, surrounded by a lake, inside a megacity of hostile locals. The Aztecs could simply cut off the bridges at any moment. Driven by fear and a breathtaking level of audacity, Cortés executed a brazen plan. He and his armed captains confidently walked into Moctezuma's private quarters. In a move that shocked the world, they placed the emperor under house arrest. Astonishingly, Moctezuma complied, hoping to avoid a massive bloodbath in his beloved capital. For months, Cortés effectively ruled the entire empire through a captive puppet. Cortés demanded mountains of gold, ordered Christian crosses to be placed on sacred Aztec temples, and deeply offended the local priests and nobility. The tension in the city was like a massively stretched rubber band, ready to snap at any second. But then, an unexpected plot twist arrived. Cortés had to leave the city temporarily to deal with a heavily armed rival Spanish expedition sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest him. He took his best men and left his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge of the volatile capital. This would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. Alvarado was notoriously cruel and deeply paranoid. Without Cortés's political cunning to keep him in check, he saw a deadly rebellion hiding in every shadow. Soon after, the Aztecs celebrated the sacred festival of Tlaxcalans. Thousands of completely unarmed nobles and elite warriors danced in the main temple courtyard. Alvarado, convinced this massive gathering was a prelude to an ambush, decided to strike first. He ordered his heavily armed men to lock the temple gates. What followed was a horrific massacre. The Spanish slaughtered the completely defenseless Aztec elite, wiping out an entire generation of leaders in minutes. It wasn't a battle, it was a butchery. The stretched rubber band of tension we talked about. It had officially and violently snapped. The entire city of Tenochtitlan erupted in absolute, unstoppable fury. The Spanish were no longer the captors, they were now trapped in a cage of their own making. Meanwhile, Cortés had successfully defeated his Spanish rivals and was marching back to Tenochtitlan, expecting a victory parade and a pacified city. Instead, he marched directly into a death trap. He managed to rejoin his besieged men in the palace, but the moment he entered, the gates were sealed. They were completely surrounded by hundreds of thousands of furious warriors. Inside the palace walls, food and fresh water were rapidly running out. The Aztecs relentlessly bombarded the compound. The Spanish were drowning in a sea of hostility, their superior weapons practically useless against the sheer, overwhelming numbers. In a desperate bid to calm the angry mob and buy some time, Cortés turned to his ultimate hostage. He brought Moctezuma out to the palace roof. The once mighty emperor stood before his people, raising his hands, attempting to order them to stand down and let the Spanish leave peacefully. But the psychological spell was completely broken. The people had lost all respect for their captive emperor. They saw him as a weak puppet. Instead of obedience, the crowd responded with a barrage of stones and darts. During the chaos, a heavy stone struck Moctezuma directly. He fell. Shortly after, the great emperor of the Aztecs died. Whether he succumbed to his wounds or was assassinated by the Spanish remains fiercely debated. But the result was the same, the Spanish had lost their only shield. Without their royal hostage, staying in the city meant absolute, certain death. They had to escape immediately. They packed provisions, but many soldiers were so blinded by greed they loaded their pockets with heavy, stolen gold. On the dark, relentlessly rainy night of June 30th, 1520, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies attempted to sneak out of the city across a narrow causeway. This event would go down in history as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. For a few agonizing minutes, the stealthy plan seemed to be working. But the Aztecs were watching. An alarm sounded. The deep, terrifying boom of the massive temple war drum echoed through the rainy night. Suddenly, the dark lake surface boiled with thousands of war canoes. The trap was sprung, and the retreating army was completely surrounded in the dark. The narrow stone causeway instantly became a brutal, slippery slaughterhouse. The Aztecs had strategically removed sections of the wooden bridges, leaving gaping chasms of dark water. In the chaos, hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies were pushed into the lake. Those who greedily stuffed their pockets with gold sank immediately. It was a very grim historical lesson in basic economics and physics. Stolen gold might buy you an empire, but it makes for a terrible flotation device. Only a battered, exhausted fraction of the army made it to the mainland. Legend says Cortés sat under an ancient cypress tree and wept openly at the devastation. Back in Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs celebrated wildly. They had successfully driven out the invaders, killed the false emperor, and reclaimed their beautiful city. They thought they had won. But they were tragically wrong. The Spanish had been driven out, yes, but they left behind something far deadlier than sharp swords, fast horses, or explosive cannons. They left behind a microscopic, completely invisible assassin, smallpox. The indigenous people of the Americas had absolutely zero built-in immunity to these strange old world diseases. In the autumn of 1520, a horrific plague swept through Tenochtitlan. It was a terrifying biological apocalypse that moved much faster than any marching army ever could. The vicious disease didn't care if you were a poor peasant, a high priest, or an elite eagle warrior. The city streets were soon filled with the dying. It even killed Moctezuma's brave successor, Emperor Cuitlahuac, after he had been in power for just 80 days. The Aztec leadership was completely and utterly shattered. While the magnificent megacity starved and suffered under the terrible plague, Cortés was not retreating to the coast to sail home. He was incredibly busy rebuilding his forces. He safely retreated to his loyal allies in Tlaxcala. Surprisingly, despite their incredibly heavy losses during the Night of Sorrows, the Tlaxcalans remained fiercely committed to the alliance. Using Aztec enemies who clearly saw the profound weakness of the dying capital, Cortés managed to amass a colossal new army of over 100,000 angry indigenous warriors. But he knew a simple land assault wasn't enough. He absolutely needed to control the massive lake. So, he ordered his men to do something bordering on madness. He had his men build 13 shallow draft brigantines, essentially floating wooden fortresses, in pieces, deep in the mountains, miles away from any actual body of water. But building the ships was only half the battle. They now had to transport these massive wooden fortresses over treacherous mountain passes to reach the lake. Thousands of indigenous allies literally carried the heavy wooden ship pieces on their backs for over 60 miles. It was a spectacular logistical miracle. By April 1521, the 13 brigantines were fully assembled and launched into Lake Texcoco. Cortés was finally ready to choke the life out of the capital. His first major tactical move upon arriving at the lake was brutal but brilliant. He ordered his men to destroy the vital Chapultepec aqueduct. This instantly cut off Tenochtitlan's primary supply of fresh drinking water. In a city surrounded by salty, undrinkable lake water, this was an absolute death sentence. Inside the besieged city, the new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, absolutely refused to surrender. He prepared his starving people for a heroic, desperate defense to the last man. He mobilized thousands of Aztec war canoes, hoping to overwhelm the Spanish fleet using the exact same swarm tactics that worked so well during the Night of Sorrows. In May 1521, the colossal naval battle began. The lake was entirely covered with canoes rushing fearlessly toward the strange, floating wooden castles. But the brigantines were custom-built for this exact environment. They were fast, heavily armored against projectiles, and most importantly, equipped with deadly cannons. The wind caught the Spanish sails, and the massive ships plowed straight through the fragile wooden canoes, easily splintering them into pieces. The Spanish cannons unleashed a devastating, thunderous barrage across the water, completely obliterating the Aztec naval forces before they could even get close. Cortés now had absolute, total control of the lake. The blockade was officially set. Nothing was getting in, and absolutely no one was getting out. He then divided his massive army of 100,000 men into 3 main divisions, attacking the city simultaneously across the 3 primary stone causeways. But the siege was a slow, agonizing grind. The Aztecs fought fiercely for every single inch, turning every broken bridge and canal into a deadly choke point. To advance, the Spanish had to literally dismantle the beautiful city block by block, filling in the canals with rubble just to allow their horses and cannons to cross. It was a tragic, grueling process. The crown jewel of Mesoamerica was literally being erased from the map, stone by stone, day after agonizing day. For 93 brutal days, the intense battle raged. The Aztec defenders were slowly pushed back into the northern section of the island, a district known as Tlatelolco. Inside this shrinking pocket of resistance, the conditions were absolute hell. The Spanish land siege and the naval blockade were working with terrifying efficiency. There was absolutely no food. The starving people were reduced to eating tree bark, roots, insects, and even boiling the leather from their own shields just to survive. Yet, Emperor Cuauhtémoc stood firm. He rallied his starving, plague-ridden warriors, fiercely rejecting any notion of surrender to the invaders who had destroyed their world. Cortés, realizing the immense cost of this urban warfare and wanting to capture the city intact, repeatedly sent envoys offering terms of peace and amnesty. But the Aztec leadership and their priests flatly refused. To prove their defiance, they staged terrifying psychological warfare against the besieging army. Whenever the Spanish retreated for the night, they could hear massive war drums echoing across the lake, followed by a horrifying sight atop the Great Temple. They were forced to watch from afar as their captured comrades were sacrificed to the Aztec god of war. It was a calculated move to break their morale. This chilling spectacle traumatized the soldiers, but it also solidified Cortés's final, ruthless decision: there would be no more mercy. Total annihilation. The Spanish unleashed a relentless, non-stop artillery bombardment on Tlatelolco. The floating wooden brigantines blasted the remaining coastal defenses and buildings into dust. Meanwhile, the Tlaxcalans and other indigenous allies, carrying generations of deep-seated hatred, poured into the city. They showed absolutely zero restraint against their ancient oppressors. The slaughter was unprecedented. Tens of thousands of Aztec civilians and elite warriors perished, their stylized silhouettes fading away, filling the canals and ruined streets. By early August, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of death. The once gleaming white pyramids were stained red and covered in a thick layer of ash. Finally, the breaking point arrived. On August 13, 1521, as the very last defenses crumbled, Emperor Cuauhtémoc boarded a small wooden canoe, attempting to slip away through the smoke. But there was no escape. His small canoe was quickly intercepted by a fast, heavily armed Spanish brigantine. The final emperor of the Aztecs was captured. Cuauhtémoc was brought before Hernán Cortés. Standing amidst the smoldering, blood-soaked ruins of his once great civilization, the emperor stood tall, entirely unbroken in spirit. He pointed to Cortés's dagger and asked to be killed, demanding an honorable warrior's death. But Cortés refused. He needed the captive emperor alive. A deafening silence finally fell over Lake Texcoco. After 93 brutal days of unimaginable horror, the mighty, invincible Aztec Empire was officially dead. The fall of the Aztecs is often lazily framed as a simple triumph of European technology. But in reality, it was a catastrophic, perfect storm. It was a complex tragedy fueled by a localized Mesoamerican civil war against Aztec oppression, the ruthless opportunism of Cortés, and the apocalyptic invisible killer, Smallpox. The greedy Spanish frantically searched the smoldering ruins for the legendary Aztec gold, but they found shockingly little. Most of it was still sitting at the bottom of the lake. Instead of packing up and going home, Cortés ordered the complete destruction of the remaining pyramids. They used the very same sacred stones to build a brand new capital. Right on top of the bloody, sunken ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish constructed the foundation of what would eventually become the massive, bustling modern-day Mexico City. But the indigenous people didn't simply vanish. A profound, often painful cultural fusion began, blending Spanish and native traditions into an entirely new, vibrant identity. Figures like La Malinche remain deeply controversial today. To some, she is the ultimate traitor who sold out her people, to others, she is the symbolic mother of the modern Mexican nation. Even today, the legacy of the Aztecs is everywhere. Just look at the modern Mexican flag, an eagle perched on a cactus, eating a snake, the original ancient prophecy of Tenochtitlan. The magnificent floating megacity may be gone, buried under tons of concrete and slowly sinking into the soft lakebed, but its powerful ghosts still echo through the bustling streets. History is rarely just a simple story of good versus evil or strong versus weak. It's messy, wildly unpredictable, and shaped just as much by microscopic viruses as it is by human ambition. Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper into the crazy, chaotic, and fascinating stories of our human past, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. See you next time.